The red dust swirled around Amy's boots as she knelt beside a broken stone pillar. Her scanner beeped quietly, detecting traces of metal deep inside the carved rock. She wiped sweat from her forehead and looked across the empty landscape of Ashara. 3 months ago, this planet had seemed like just another dead world on their survey list. Now she wondered what secrets lay buried beneath its crimson surface. Amy Carter had joined the research vessel Wanderer to study alien life, but so far they had found nothing living on 12 different worlds. Her team leader, Dr. Frank Wilson, kept telling her to stay positive. "Every dead world teaches us something," he would say. But Amy wanted to find something alive, something that would prove life could survive anywhere in the universe. The other members of her survey team were working near their landing shuttle, 2 kilometers away. Amy preferred to work alone when she could. It helped her think clearly about what she was seeing. The ruins around her were different from anything they had found before. The stonework was too perfect, too smooth. Whatever built these structures had technology far beyond simple tools. She stood up and walked toward a large opening in the canyon wall. The scanner in her hand showed unusual energy readings coming from deep inside. Amy knew she should call the others, but she wanted to look first. Just a quick peek to see what was causing the readings. The cave entrance was tall enough for 3 people to walk through side by side. Strange symbols were carved around the opening, glowing faintly with a blue light that seemed to come from inside the stone itself. Amy had never seen anything like it. She took pictures with her camera and then stepped inside. The tunnel sloped downward for about 50 meters before opening into a massive chamber. Amy stopped and stared in wonder. The walls were covered with crystals that pulsed with soft light. The ceiling rose high above her head, disappearing into shadows. But what made her heart race were the carvings covering every surface. They showed creatures that looked like cats, but much larger, with wings spread wide and lightning dancing around their bodies. The detail was incredible. Amy could see individual scales on their skin and the proud look in their carved eyes. These weren't just decorations. They were portraits made by beings who had lived alongside these magnificent creatures. Amy walked deeper into the chamber, her scanner beeping more rapidly with each step. The energy readings were getting stronger. She followed a path marked by glowing stones set into the floor. The path led to the far end of the chamber, where a natural ledge jutted out from the wall. On the ledge sat a figure that made Amy freeze in place. It was one of the creatures from the carvings, but this one was real. It sat perfectly still, watching her with golden eyes that seemed to hold the wisdom of ages. The creature was about the size of a large horse with a sleek body covered in copper-colored scales that shifted and gleamed in the crystal light. Wing membranes stretched between elongated finger bones folded neatly against its back. A long tail twitched slightly as it studied her. Amy's first thought was to run. Her second thought was to call for help. But something in those ancient eyes stopped her from doing either. The creature wasn't threatening her. It was simply watching, waiting to see what she would do. She took a careful step forward. The creature's head tilted slightly, like a cat trying to understand a new sound. Amy took another step. The air around the creature seemed to shimmer with tiny sparks of electricity, but they didn't feel dangerous. They felt like the static charge before a gentle summer storm. "Hello," Amy said softly. Her voice echoed in the crystal chamber. The creature's ears, which looked almost cat-like despite their scaled surface, twitched at the sound. It made no move to flee or attack. It just kept watching her with those incredible golden eyes. Amy slowly sat down on the stone floor, about 10 meters away from the ledge. She had learned that many animals felt less threatened when humans made themselves smaller. She wasn't sure if the same rule applied to this creature, but it seemed worth trying. "I'm not going to hurt you," she continued in the same soft voice. "I'm just here to learn about this place, about your people." The creature's head tilted the other way. Amy could swear she saw intelligence in its expression, the kind of deep thinking that came from a truly aware mind. This wasn't just an animal. This was a being who could understand, who could reason and feel. For several minutes, they simply looked at each other. Amy noticed that the creature's breathing was slow and calm. Its tail had stopped twitching. The electrical shimmer around its body had faded to barely visible sparkles. Whatever it had decided about her, it wasn't afraid. Amy's radio crackled to life. "Amy, where are you? We're ready to head back to the ship." It was Frank's voice, sounding impatient. The sound made the creature's ears flatten against its head. The electrical shimmer flared brighter, and Amy could feel the hair on her arms stand up from the static charge in the air. The creature was afraid of the radio, or maybe of the voices coming from it. Amy quickly turned the radio off. The creature's ears slowly returned to their normal position, but its eyes never left her face. "That was my team," Amy explained quietly. "Other humans like me. But I won't bring them here if you don't want them to come." The creature made a sound, a low rumble that might have been a purr, or might have been something else entirely. Amy felt goosebumps rise on her arms, but not from fear. From excitement. This was first contact with an intelligent species, and it was happening to her. Her radio crackled again. "Amy, respond, please. Your signal is showing you're in the canyon system." Amy looked at the creature, who was watching the radio with obvious concern. She made a decision that would change everything. She took the radio from her belt and set it on the ground beside her, then pushed it away with her foot. The gesture was clear. She was choosing to stay and talk with the creature rather than answer her team. The creature's golden eyes widened slightly. It made that rumbling sound again, but softer this time. Then, in a movement so graceful it seemed like flowing water, it spread its wings and glided down from the ledge to land on the chamber floor. Amy's heart pounded as the magnificent being approached her. It stopped just out of arm's reach and folded its wings against its back. Up close, Amy could see that its scales weren't just copper-colored. They shifted through shades of gold and bronze and deep red, like a living sunset. The creature lowered its great head until its golden eyes were level with Amy's. She could feel the warmth of its breath and see her own reflection in its pupils. For a moment that stretched like eternity, human and dragon cat studied each other in perfect silence. Then the creature did something that made Amy's breath catch in her throat. It extended one wing slightly and brushed the very tip against her hand. The touch lasted only a second, but it sent a tingle of electricity up Amy's arm that felt like greeting, like recognition, like the beginning of something wonderful. When the creature folded its wing back, Amy knew that her life had just changed forever. She was no longer just a scientist studying dead worlds. She was the first human to make contact with a being who had been waiting in solitude for longer than she could imagine. The purple flowers from Earth's meadows looked strange against the red rocks of Ashara. Amy had grown them in the ship's greenhouse, carefully tending each bloom until they were perfect. Now she carried them in a simple water container as she made her way down the familiar path to the crystal chamber. It had been 2 weeks since her first meeting with the magnificent creature. She had returned the next day and the day after that and every day since. Each visit felt like a careful dance where both partners were learning the steps as they went. Amy had started calling him Ember because of the way his copper scales caught the light like glowing coals. She didn't know if Ember was male or female, but something about his proud bearing reminded her of the male lions she had studied back on Earth. Ember seemed to accept the name, or at least he didn't object when she used it. The biggest challenge had been keeping her team from finding out about him. Frank Wilson was getting suspicious about her long solo surveys. Yesterday he had asked why she needed so much time to study a bunch of old rocks. Amy had made up a story about finding complex mineral formations that required detailed analysis. She hated lying to her team, but she knew what would happen if they discovered Ember. He would become a specimen, something to be studied and tested and possibly taken away from his home. Amy reached the cave entrance and paused to look at the glowing symbols. She had been trying to understand what they meant. Her translation software had identified patterns that suggested language, but the meanings remained unclear. She suspected they were warnings or perhaps prayers, meant to protect whatever lay inside. "Hello, Ember," she called softly as she entered the chamber. "I brought you something new today." The great creature was waiting for her in his usual spot, a raised section of crystal near the back wall. Over the past 2 weeks, Amy had learned to read his moods from the way he held himself. Today he seemed calm but alert, his golden eyes following her movement as she approached. Amy sat in her usual place, about 5 meters away from Ember. She had tried sitting closer once, but the electrical field around his body had made her skin tingle uncomfortably. Whatever generated that field seemed to be beyond his control, keeping others at a distance whether he wanted them there or not. "I thought you might like these," Amy said, setting the container of purple flowers between them. "They're from my home planet. We call them violets." Ember's head tilted as he studied the flowers. He made a sound that Amy had learned meant interest, a soft trill that reminded her of wind chimes. Slowly, carefully, he extended his long neck toward the container. Amy held her breath as his nose came within centimeters of the flowers. But as soon as he got close, tiny sparks jumped from his scales to the metal container. Ember pulled back quickly, his eyes showing what Amy could only call frustration. He wanted to examine the flowers, maybe even smell them, but his own electrical field prevented it. "I'm sorry," Amy said gently. "I should have used a different container." Ember made another sound, this one lower and sadder. Amy's heart ached for him. She was beginning to understand just how isolated he truly was. The electrical field that protected him also trapped him, keeping him from touching anything or anyone. Amy pulled out her tablet and showed Ember pictures she had taken of Earth. She had discovered he enjoyed these visual stories, especially images of animals and landscapes. Today she had prepared something special, recordings of Earth sounds. "These are birds," Amy explained as she played a recording of Dawnbird's song. Ember's ears perked up immediately. His eyes grew wide as the cheerful chirping filled the chamber. Amy played other sounds: ocean waves, wind through trees, the low call of whales in the deep sea. With each new sound, Ember became more animated. He moved his head as if trying to locate the source of the sounds. When Amy played a recording of cats purring, Ember made an answering sound that was remarkably similar. Amy laughed with delight, and Ember's eyes seemed to sparkle in response. "You understand music, don't you?" Amy said. She scrolled through her files until she found a piece by Bach, something gentle and mathematical. As the music played, Ember closed his eyes and swayed slightly, as if the sound was a physical thing he could feel. When the music ended, Ember looked directly at Amy and made a series of sounds that were clearly intentional communication. Amy had been recording everything, hoping to find patterns in his vocalizations. She played back what he had just said, and Ember repeated it more slowly as if he was trying to teach her. Amy spent the next hour attempting to copy Ember's sounds. Most of them were beyond her vocal range, but she managed a few simple tones. Each time she succeeded, Ember made that pleased trilling sound. He was definitely trying to teach her his language. As the lesson continued, Amy noticed something wonderful. The electrical field around Ember was growing weaker. When he focused on communicating with her, the sparks diminished until they were barely visible. Amy realized that his emotional state affected the field somehow. When he was calm and happy, the barrier between them grew thinner. Amy's radio buzzed with an incoming message. She quickly turned the volume down, but not before Ember's ears flattened and his field flared bright with sudden energy. He still didn't like the sound of other human voices. "Amy, this is Frank. You're needed back at the ship for the weekly team meeting." "That's an order." Amy looked at Ember, who was watching her with obvious concern. Over the past 2 weeks, he had learned to recognize the radio as something that took her away from their visits. "I have to go," Amy said softly, "but I'll come back tomorrow. I promise." Ember made a low sound that might have been disappointment. As Amy packed her things, he glided down from his resting place and approached as close as his field would allow. For a moment, they looked at each other across the barrier of energy that surrounded him. Then Ember did something that made Amy's heart skip. He extended one wing and held it steady, fighting against the electrical discharge that sparked along its surface. Amy understood the gesture. She held out her hand toward his wing, letting the tiny sparks dance across her fingers. It stung, but it was bearable, and it was the closest they could come to touching. The connection lasted only seconds before Ember had to pull away, but Amy could see the longing in his golden eyes. He wanted contact, wanted to close the distance between them, but something prevented it. Amy made a silent promise as she left the chamber. She would find a way to help him overcome whatever was keeping them apart. Back at the ship, Amy sat through Frank's boring meeting while her mind raced with ideas. She researched electrical fields and bioelectric organisms late into the night. She learned about creatures on Earth that generated electricity for defense and communication. But Ember's field seemed different, more complex and somehow more purposeful. The breakthrough came when Amy was studying the symbols around the cave entrance. Her translation software had finally identified key elements of the writing. The symbols weren't just decorative. They were instructions, warnings, and most importantly, they were a history. The language was ancient but systematic. Amy worked through the night piece by piece until she understood the basic message carved into the stone. It told the story of a people called the Solari, who had lived on Ashara thousands of years ago. They had been guardians of great power, protectors of knowledge and keepers of peace. But something had gone wrong. The carving spoke of a great dying that had claimed the Solari civilization. They had created guardians, beings like Ember, to protect their world after they were gone. These guardians were given great power, but also great isolation. They could protect but never touch, serve but never connect. Amy stared at her translation notes, understanding flooding through her. Ember wasn't just the last of his kind. He was the last guardian of a dead civilization, bound by ancient programming to protect a world that no longer needed protection. His electrical field wasn't just a natural defense. It was a cage created by his own people, designed to keep him separate from everything and everyone. The loneliness he must have endured was beyond anything Amy could imagine. Thousands of years alone, watching and waiting for a purpose that would never come. No wonder he seemed so fascinated by her company. She might be the first intelligent being he had spoken to in millennia. Amy looked at her translation work and made another discovery that chilled her. The carvings mentioned that isolation would eventually drive the Guardians to madness. There were warnings about what a Guardian might do if their mind finally broke under the weight of endless solitude. Amy realized she wasn't just Ember's first friend in ages. She might be his only hope for maintaining his sanity, and if she was reading the ancient warnings correctly, time was running out. The question was whether she could find a way to break through the barriers that separated them before it was too late. Thunder rolled across the dead landscape as Amy hurried toward Ember's cave. The storm had come out of nowhere, turning Ashara's red sky black with swirling clouds. Rain fell in heavy drops that stung like tiny hammers against her protective suit. She clutched her equipment bag close to her chest and ran faster. Amy had been working on a solution for 3 weeks now. Every night after her official duties were done, she studied bioelectric fields and energy manipulation. She had built a small device that might possibly allow her to safely touch Ember without being shocked by his protective field. But she hadn't had a chance to test it yet. The storm was getting worse. Lightning split the sky with brilliant white fire, and the thunder that followed shook the ground beneath Amy's feet. She reached the cave entrance just as the wind began to howl like a living thing. The glowing symbols around the cave mouth flickered and pulsed, responding to the electrical energy in the storm. Amy rushed inside, grateful to be out of the rain. But as she entered the main chamber, she realized something was wrong. The crystals that usually glowed with soft light were now blazing like tiny suns. The air itself seemed to buzz with energy that made her skin tingle and her hair stand on end. Ember was in the center of it all, but he looked nothing like the calm, majestic creature Amy had come to know. His copper scales were flashing with brilliant light, sending arcs of electricity dancing across the crystal walls. His wings were spread wide and his head was thrown back as if he was screaming, though no sound reached Amy's ears. He was trapped in his own electrical field, the barrier around him now a prison of crackling energy that pulsed and writhed like something alive. Amy could see his golden eyes wide with terror and pain. He was fighting against whatever was happening to him, but he couldn't break free. Amy dropped her bag and ran toward him. "Ember!" She called out, but her voice was lost in the electrical storm that filled the chamber. She got within 3 meters before the field repelled her, sending her stumbling backward with her hands tingling from the shock. She tried again, forcing herself closer despite the painful sparks that jumped from Ember's body to hers. This time she managed to get within 2 meters before the energy became too intense. She could see Ember looking at her through the barrier, his eyes pleading for help she didn't know how to give. Amy pulled out her device, a simple tool she had built from ship components. It was designed to create a small counter field that might cancel out Ember's electrical discharge. But looking at the storm of energy surrounding him now, Amy realized her little device was hopelessly inadequate. "Hold on," she called to Ember. "I'm going to try something." Amy activated her device and stepped forward again. For a moment it seemed to work. The sparks around her diminished and she managed to get half a meter closer. But then Ember's field flared even brighter, and Amy's device overloaded with a sharp crack. She was thrown backward, her hands burned and her device destroyed. Ember saw what happened and made a sound that cut through Amy's heart. It was pure anguish, the cry of a being who wanted desperately to be helped but couldn't accept it without causing harm. The electrical storm around him intensified, and Amy realized with horror that her presence was making it worse. He was fighting so hard to reach her that he was losing control of his own power. Amy sat on the crystal floor, staring at her ruined device and burned hands. Outside, the natural storm continued to rage, but inside the cave, Ember's personal storm was far more terrible. She watched helplessly as he struggled against the energy field that had protected and imprisoned him for thousands of years. Then she noticed something. The patterns of light dancing around Ember weren't random. They pulsed and swirled in response to his emotional state, growing brighter when he was agitated and dimming slightly when he looked at her. Amy had been thinking about his field as a simple electrical barrier, but it was much more complex than that. It was connected to his mind, his feelings, his very sense of self. Amy remembered her translation of the ancient carvings. The Solari hadn't just given their guardians electrical defenses. They had woven the protection so deeply into their beings that it became part of who they were. Ember couldn't turn off his field any more than Amy could turn off her heartbeat. But there had been something else in those ancient writings, something Amy had dismissed as poetic language. The carving spoke of guardians finding peace through the touch of understanding and connection beyond the physical realm. At the time, Amy had thought it was just metaphor. Now she wondered if it was literal instruction. Amy closed her eyes and tried to remember everything she had learned about Ember over the past weeks. He was intelligent, lonely, and desperate for connection. He had been alone for millennia, watching over a dead world because that was what his people had programmed him to do. The electrical field wasn't just protection, it was punishment, ensuring that he could never forget his duty by forming attachments to other beings. But what if the ancient Solari had built in an escape clause? What if they had created a way for their guardians to find peace if their long service ever became too much to bear? Amy opened her eyes and looked at Ember, still trapped in his storm of light and energy. She made a decision that terrified and exhilarated her at the same time. She would try to reach him not with technology, but with pure human determination and compassion. Amy stood up and walked toward Ember, ignoring the sparks that began to dance across her skin. She got closer than she ever had before, close enough to see the individual scales on his magnificent body, close enough to see the tears of liquid light that ran from his golden eyes. "Ember," she said, her voice somehow carrying through the electrical storm. "I know you're in pain. I know you've been alone for so long that it's driving you crazy. But you're not alone anymore. I'm here, and I'm not leaving." Ember's eyes focused on her, and for a moment the storm around him lessened. Amy took another step forward. The energy field hit her like a wall, but she pushed through it, accepting the pain as the price of connection. "I've been studying your people's writings," Amy continued, her voice strained but determined. "They called you guardians, but they also called you prisoners. You've been loyal to them for thousands of years, but they're gone, Ember. Your duty is done. You can let go now." Amy was close enough to touch him now if she dared. The electrical energy crawling across her skin felt like being stung by 1,000 insects. But she endured it. She could see Ember fighting to control his field, fighting to make it safe for her to come closer. Then the natural storm outside reached its peak. A massive bolt of lightning struck the canyon, and the cave's crystals responded by blazing with unbearable light. Ember's control shattered, and his electrical field exploded outward in a wave of pure energy. Amy was thrown across the chamber, hitting the crystal wall hard enough to see stars. But as she lay there struggling to breathe, she saw something incredible. The explosion of energy had cracked something inside Ember's field. For just a moment, just a few seconds, the barrier around him flickered and died. In that brief window, Ember looked more vulnerable than Amy had ever seen him. His scales were dim, his breathing labored, and his golden eyes were filled with a mixture of hope and terror. He was afraid to hope that the barrier might be failing, afraid to believe that he might finally be free. Amy forced herself to stand, despite her injuries. The moment wouldn't last long. She could already see the electrical field beginning to rebuild itself around Ember, but now she knew it was possible. The barrier could be broken, not with technology, but with the right combination of emotional connection and perfect timing. She also knew something else now, something that filled her with both excitement and dread. The ancient carvings had mentioned that when guardians finally found peace, their long service would end. Amy wasn't just trying to help Ember overcome his isolation. She might be trying to help him find a way to die with dignity after millennia of lonely service. But looking at his tortured expression, Amy knew she had to try. No being, no matter how powerful or important, deserved to suffer alone forever. She would find a way to break through Ember's barrier, even if it meant saying goodbye to the most magnificent creature she had ever encountered. The storm outside began to fade, and Ember's field stabilized once again, but something had changed between them. Amy had seen him vulnerable, and he had seen her willing to risk everything to reach him. The next time they met, Amy promised herself she would be ready to try again, and this time, she wouldn't let anything stop her from touching the ancient guardian who had waited so long for someone to care. Amy's hands shook as she prepared the medical supplies in her small quarters aboard the Wanderer. The burns from yesterday's attempt to reach Ember were healing slowly, but they reminded her of just how dangerous his electrical field could be. She had lied to Dr. Wilson about how she got the injuries, claiming she had touched a malfunctioning scanner. He had believed her, but barely. 3 days had passed since the storm, and Amy had spent every moment planning her next approach. She couldn't use technology to break through Ember's barrier. She had to find another way, something based on understanding rather than force. The answer lay in the ancient Solari writings she had been translating piece by piece. The breakthrough had come that morning when Amy finally decoded a section about the Guardian's creation. The Solari hadn't just given their protectors electrical defenses. They had linked the barriers to the Guardian's emotional state as a safeguard. If a Guardian ever became too aggressive or lost control, their own distress would strengthen the field until they could calm down. But the writings also mentioned something called the Mercy Touch, a way for Guardians to lower their defenses when they experienced genuine connection with another being. The process was dangerous for both parties, requiring perfect trust and timing. Most importantly, it could only work if the Guardian truly wanted to be reached. Amy packed her supplies and made her way back to the canyon. Frank had been asking more questions about her extended surveys, and she was running out of excuses. Today would have to be the day she either succeeded or gave up entirely. The crystal chamber was quiet when Amy arrived. Ember was resting on his usual ledge, but Amy could see the exhaustion in his golden eyes. The storm had taken a terrible toll on him. His scales were dimmer than usual, and his wings drooped with weariness. "Hello, Ember," Amy said softly as she entered. "I brought something different today." Instead of her usual gifts or translation equipment, Amy carried only a simple blanket from her quarters and a thermos of warm soup. She sat in her customary spot and spread the blanket on the crystal floor, then poured soup into a cup and held it in her hands. "I've been thinking about what happened during the storm," Amy said. "You were trying so hard to reach me that you nearly burned yourself out. I think I understand now. Your field isn't just protection. It's prison, isn't it?" Ember's ears twitched at her words. He made a low sound that Amy had learned meant agreement, but it was colored with such sadness that it broke her heart. "I've been reading about your people," Amy continued. "The Solari created you to be guardians, but they also made sure you could never form attachments that might interfere with your duty. They thought they were being wise, protecting you from the pain of loss, but they just created a different kind of pain, didn't they?" Ember rose from his resting place and glided down to the chamber floor. He approached as close as his field would allow, his eyes fixed on Amy's face. She could see hunger in his expression, not for food but for understanding, for someone who finally grasped the magnitude of his isolation. Amy set down her soup and spoke about her own loneliness. She told Ember about growing up in the refugee camps after Earth's water wars, about losing her family and spending years moving from one temporary home to another. She talked about joining the space program, partly to escape her grief, hoping that among the stars she might find something to fill the empty places in her heart. As she spoke, Amy noticed Ember's electrical field beginning to fluctuate. The steady glow around his body pulsed in rhythm with her words, growing brighter when she described pain and dimming when she talked about hope. His field was responding to her emotions as much as his own. "I think that's why I keep coming back here," Amy said. "Not just because you're an amazing discovery, but because I recognize something in you. We're both alone, both carrying burdens that are too heavy for one person to bear." Ember made a sound that was almost a whisper, so soft Amy barely heard it, but she understood its meaning. He was telling her that she wasn't alone anymore, that her presence had given him something he had thought lost forever. Amy stood up slowly and took a step toward Ember. His field sparked warningly, but she didn't retreat. "I want to try something," she said, "but I need you to trust me completely." "Can you do that?" Ember's golden eyes met hers, and Amy saw his answer in their depths. After millennia of solitude, he was ready to risk everything for the chance of genuine connection. Amy began to walk forward, speaking in a calm, steady voice about everything she had learned to appreciate about Ember. His intelligence, his dignity, his incredible patience with her clumsy attempts to understand his language. She talked about how his presence had changed her, how meeting him had shown her that wonder and beauty still existed in the universe. With each step, the electrical field around Ember grew more agitated, sending painful shocks through Amy's body. But she also noticed something else. The field was responding to Ember's emotions, and right now those emotions were a mixture of hope and terror. He wanted her to reach him but was afraid of what might happen if she did. Amy was close enough now to see the individual patterns on Ember's scales, close enough to feel the heat radiating from his body. The electrical energy surrounding him was like walking through liquid fire, but she pushed forward, focusing on Ember's eyes rather than her own pain. "I'm not afraid," Amy said, though her voice shook with the effort of speaking through the electrical assault. "I trust you, Ember. I know you won't hurt me." Something shifted in Ember's expression. The terror faded from his golden eyes, replaced by a determination that Amy had never seen before. He was making a choice, fighting against thousands of years of conditioning to lower his defenses for the first time since his creation. The electrical field around Ember began to pulse more slowly, its chaotic energy gradually organizing into a steady rhythm. Amy realized she was feeling his heartbeat translated into electrical pulses, the most intimate possible sharing of his life force. She reached out her hand, moving slowly and deliberately toward Ember's scaled cheek. The energy field resisted her, pushing against her palm like a solid wall, but Amy could feel it weakening as Ember exerted his will against his own defenses. "That's it," Amy whispered. "You can do this. You can choose to let me in." The moment of contact was unlike anything Amy had ever experienced. Her palm touched Ember's warm scales, and suddenly she was flooded with images, memories, emotions that weren't her own. She saw the glory of Solari civilization at its height, cities that floated in the sky and beings of incredible wisdom and beauty. She felt Ember's pride in serving as their guardian, his joy in protecting something so precious. But then came the darker memories, the plague that swept through Solari society, turning their own technology against them, the desperate last days as the civilization crumbled and died, leaving only their guardians to watch over empty ruins. Amy experienced Ember's confusion as years turned to decades, decades to centuries, and still no new Solari appeared to claim their inheritance. She felt the weight of millennia pressing down on Ember's mind, the gradual erosion of hope as he realized his people were truly gone, the terrible loneliness that had eaten away at his sanity like acid, leaving him barely able to remember why he continued his vigil. And finally, Amy felt Ember's wonder and gratitude at her arrival. In her presence, he had remembered what it felt like to have purpose beyond mere duty, to care about someone and be cared for in return. The vision lasted only seconds in real time, but it left Amy gasping and tears streaming down her face. She understood now why Ember's field had been so difficult to breach. It wasn't just protecting his body. It was protecting his mind from the overwhelming force of his own memories and emotions. Ember's golden eyes were wide with amazement as he stared at Amy's hand still resting against his cheek. He made a sound of pure wonder, as if he couldn't quite believe that the barrier between them had finally fallen. Amy felt the electrical field settling into a new pattern around them both. No longer a wall, but a gentle current that connected rather than separated. She could sense Ember's emotions as clearly as her own, and she knew he could feel hers as well. "You're not alone anymore," Amy whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "And neither am I." Ember's response was a low rumble of contentment that Amy felt as much as heard. For the first time in thousands of years, the ancient guardian was at peace, but their moment of connection was interrupted by the sound of voices echoing from the cave entrance. Amy's blood turned to ice as she recognized Frank Wilson's voice calling her name. Her team had found her at last, and they were coming to investigate what she had been hiding in the crystal chamber. Amy looked at Ember, whose ears had flattened at the sound of approaching humans. His electrical field began to flare again, responding to his sudden anxiety. The fragile connection they had built was about to be tested in the worst possible way. "Stay calm," Amy whispered urgently. "I'll handle this. I won't let them hurt you." But as the voices grew closer, Amy realized that protecting Ember from her own species might be the hardest challenge she had ever faced. Amy's heart hammered against her ribs as she heard boots crunching on the crystal floor behind her. She kept her hand pressed against Ember's cheek, feeling his growing agitation through their new connection. His electrical field was beginning to pulse with dangerous energy, as the sound of approaching humans triggered ancient defensive protocols. Amy, what in the name of... Frank Wilson's voice died as he stepped into the main chamber and saw Ember for the first time. 3 other team members followed Frank into the cavern. Dr. Lisa Park, the ship's biologist, made a soft gasping sound. Engineer Robert Chen raised his scanner automatically, pointing it at Ember like a weapon. Security Officer Dave Miller reached for the stunner on his belt. "Nobody move," Amy said sharply, not taking her eyes off Ember's golden gaze. "He's not dangerous unless you threaten him." "Amy, step away from that thing immediately," Frank ordered. "We don't know what it's capable of." Amy felt Ember's fear spike through their connection. The word thing hit him like a physical blow, reducing him from a sentient being to an object in the humans' minds. His electrical field flared brighter, sending warning sparks dancing across the crystal walls. "His name is Ember," Amy said firmly. "He's intelligent, and he's been alone on this world for thousands of years. I've been studying him and learning to communicate with him." "You've been studying it for weeks without reporting to your team leader," Frank said, his voice cold with anger. "Do you have any idea how dangerous that was? How many protocols you violated?" Dr. Park stepped forward, her scientific curiosity overcoming her caution. "The bioelectrical field around it is incredible. Amy, how did you manage to get so close? The energy readings are off the charts." "Please don't call him it," Amy said. "He understands every word you're saying." As if to prove her point, Ember turned his great head toward Dr. Park and made a low sound that rumbled through the chamber. Park stumbled backward, her face pale with sudden understanding that she was looking at a thinking, feeling being rather than just an exotic animal. Engineer Chen was studying his scanner readings with growing excitement. "The electromagnetic signature is unlike anything in our databases. If we could study the mechanism behind its field generation, we could revolutionize human energy technology." Amy felt Ember's distress growing stronger through their connection. He understood enough human language to know they were talking about studying him, taking him apart to learn his secrets. His field pulsed more rapidly, and tiny lightning bolts began to arc between his wing membranes. "You're scaring him," Amy warned. "Please just back away slowly and let me handle this." But Security Officer Miller was already speaking into his radio. "Command, this is Miller. We've found what Dr. Carter was hiding down here. It's some kind of alien creature with significant defensive capabilities, requesting immediate backup and containment equipment." Word containment was too much for Ember. His field exploded outward in a burst of blinding light that sent the other humans scrambling for cover. Amy felt his terror and rage washing over her through their connection. Memories of the Solari's final days when their technology had turned against them. "Stop it!" Amy shouted at her team. "You're making everything worse." Frank's voice was hard and professional. "Amy, I'm ordering you to step away from that creature." "You're clearly compromised and not thinking rationally." "I'm thinking more clearly than I ever have," Amy replied. "Ember isn't a threat to us. He's a guardian, created to protect this world from harm. But if you try to capture him, he'll defend himself." "Guard duty, huh?" Miller said with a harsh laugh. "Guarding what? A bunch of dead rocks?" Amy felt Ember's pain at those words like a knife to her heart. Through their connection, she experienced his memories of the beautiful civilization he had sworn to protect, the cities and gardens and wise beings who had trusted him with their legacy. To have it dismissed as dead rocks was agony beyond description. Ember rose to his full height, his wings spreading wide as electrical energy crackled along their surfaces. He was magnificent and terrible, a being of ancient power finally roused to anger. The crystal chamber filled with the smell of ozone and the sound of gathering storm. "You don't understand," Amy said desperately, trying to reach both Ember and her team. "He's not just some animal. He's the last guardian of an entire civilization. He's been alone here for thousands of years, faithfully protecting their ruins and their memory." "That's a beautiful story," Frank said. "But our job is science, not fairy tales. Whatever this creature is, it needs to be properly studied. On Earth, where we have proper facilities and safeguards." The word Earth sent another shock of panic through Ember. Amy felt his horror at the thought of being taken from Ashara, the only home he had ever known. His electrical field began to pulse in rhythm with his racing heartbeat, building towards something that would be devastating for everyone in the chamber. Amy made a desperate decision. She stepped directly in front of Ember, placing herself between him and her team. "If you want to take him, you'll have to go through me first." "Amy, don't be ridiculous," Frank said. "Move aside before that thing loses control completely." "He won't hurt me," Amy said with absolute certainty. "We formed a connection. I can feel what he feels, and I know he would never cause me harm." Dr. Park was staring at Amy with new understanding. "You said you can feel what it feels. Are you claiming some kind of telepathic link?" "Not telepathic exactly," Amy said. "But yes, we're connected through his bioelectrical field. I can sense his emotions, his memories. He's shown me the history of his people." "That's impossible," Frank said flatly. "You're suffering from some kind of psychological breakdown. Isolation paranoia, probably exacerbated by exposure to exotic radiation." Amy felt a flash of fury that wasn't entirely her own. Ember was growing tired of being dismissed and diminished by these humans who saw him only as a specimen to be collected. His field began to destabilize, energy arcing wildly across the chamber walls. The radio crackled with Miller's voice. "Command, we need that containment team now. The situation is deteriorating rapidly." "Belay that order," Amy called into the radio. "This is Dr. Carter. The situation is under control." "You don't have authority here," Frank snapped. "Miller, continue with your request." But before Miller could respond, Ember made his own statement. He let out a sound that was part roar, part song, and entirely alien. The crystal chamber resonated with the call, amplifying it until it seemed to come from the very walls. Every human in the cavern felt it in their bones, a sound of such pain and majesty that it left them speechless. In the silence that followed, Amy spoke quietly but clearly. "He's trying to tell you that this is his home, that he's not some prize to be taken. He's a person with rights and feelings and a history that spans millennia." Frank shook his head stubbornly. "I don't care if it can recite poetry. Our mission is to catalog and study alien life forms. This is the most significant discovery in human history, and we're not leaving it buried on some dead planet." Amy felt Ember's field building toward a truly dangerous discharge. Through their connection, she sensed his internal struggle. Part of him wanted to drive the humans away with a show of overwhelming force. But another part remembered that Amy was human too, and that destroying her team would hurt her beyond repair. The containment team's voices echoed from the cave entrance, getting closer with each passing second. Amy had only moments to find a solution that would protect both Ember and her fellow humans from the catastrophe that was building in the crystal chamber. She looked into Ember's golden eyes and saw her own desperation reflected there. They had found each other across the vast loneliness of space, two beings who understood what it meant to be isolated and lost. But now their connection might be torn apart by the very species Amy belonged to. "Please," Amy whispered to her team, not caring if they saw her tears. "He's not a thing to be studied. He's a friend. The first real friend I've made in years. Don't take him away from me." But Frank's expression remained hard and determined. "Friendship with an alien species is a luxury we can't afford. There's too much at stake scientifically." Amy felt Ember's despair wash over her like a tide. He had dared to hope, dared to believe that his long isolation might finally be ending. But humans, it seemed, were just another threat to be endured rather than companions to be treasured. The sound of boots and equipment grew louder as the containment team approached. Amy knew that in moments everything would change forever. The question was whether she had the courage to make the choice that would protect the being who had become more important to her than her own career, her own safety, or even her own life. The containment team burst into the crystal chamber carrying equipment that Amy recognized from training manuals: electromagnetic nets, stun weapons, and portable force field generators. They had come prepared to capture something dangerous, and their aggressive stance made Ember's electrical field explode with defensive energy. Amy felt his terror and rage through their connection. But underneath those emotions was something even more dangerous: despair. Ember was beginning to believe that all humans were the same, that Amy's friendship had been a cruel exception rather than a sign of hope. "Set up a perimeter," called team leader Captain Ross as his people spread out around the chamber. "Use the EM nets to contain its electrical discharge. Stop." Amy shouted, still standing between Ember and the advancing humans. "You don't understand what you're doing." But her words were lost as Ember's field reached critical intensity. Lightning arced from his body to the crystal walls, causing the ancient formations to ring like bells. The air itself seemed to catch fire with the overflow of his power, and Amy realized with growing horror that Ember wasn't just defending himself anymore. Through their connection, Amy felt his memories shifting and changing. He was remembering the final days of Solari civilization, when desperate guardians had turned their power against the very people they were meant to protect. The isolation protocols built into his mind were breaking down, and without them, his defensive systems had no limits. "Ember, no," Amy whispered, but her voice was lost in the electrical storm filling the chamber. The containment team activated their equipment, sending nets of crackling energy toward Ember. But his field was now so powerful that the nets simply vaporized before they could reach him. Captain Ross shouted for his people to fall back, but it was too late for retreat. Ember spread his wings to their full span and let out a sound that shook the entire canyon. Energy poured from his body in waves that overloaded every piece of electronic equipment in the chamber. The humans' scanners exploded in showers of sparks. Their radios went dead, and even their protective suits began to malfunction. Amy felt Ember's power building toward something catastrophic. Through their connection, she understood what was happening. His defensive systems were no longer distinguishing between immediate threats and potential ones. In his mind, all humans had become enemies that needed to be eliminated before they could harm his world. "He's going to bring down the entire canyon," Dr. Park shouted over the roar of unleashed energy. "We need to evacuate now." But Amy knew there was nowhere to run. Ember's power was connected to Ashara itself, through underground crystal formations that stretched across the continent. If he lost control completely, he could create electromagnetic pulses that would disable every human ship on the planet. Frank Wilson was shouting orders that nobody could hear over the electrical storm. Captain Ross was trying to coordinate a retreat with equipment that no longer functioned. The other humans were backing toward the cave entrance, but Amy could feel through her connection with Ember that leaving wouldn't save them. His rage was growing beyond reason, fed by millennia of suppressed loneliness and the fresh betrayal of discovering that even Amy's people saw him as nothing more than a specimen. Amy made the hardest decision of her life. She stepped forward into the heart of Ember's electrical storm. The energy hit her like a physical wall, sending agony through every nerve in her body. But Amy pushed deeper into the field, fighting her way toward the magnificent creature who was destroying himself with his own power. Through their connection, she felt his shock and horror as he realized she was deliberately walking into something that could kill her. "Ember," Amy called out, her voice somehow carrying through the chaos. "Look at me. Really look at me." Ember's golden eyes focused on her face, and Amy saw the exact moment when he truly understood what she was doing. She wasn't trying to capture him or control him. She was risking her life to reach him, to remind him that not all humans were his enemies. "I know you're scared," Amy said, taking another step deeper into the deadly field. "I know you've been betrayed before, but look around you, Ember. Look at what you're becoming." Through their connection, Amy shared her own memories with him. Not just her feelings, but her perception of his actions. She showed him how his defensive rage looked from the outside, a being of incredible power destroying everything around him in blind fury, just like the plague that had consumed his people. Ember's electrical storm faltered as understanding hit him. He was becoming the very thing the Solari had feared most, a guardian without wisdom, power without compassion. His field began to destabilize, flickering between overwhelming force and complete collapse. Amy reached out her hand toward his scaled cheek, just as she had during their first successful connection. But this time, instead of fighting to lower his defenses, Ember was fighting to regain control of them. The ancient programming that had protected him for millennia was warring with his desire to trust the human who had shown him kindness. "You have a choice," Amy said softly. "You can destroy us all and prove that humans were right to fear you, or you can choose to trust that not all of us are the same." Behind Amy, she could hear Frank Wilson calling her name, his voice filled with genuine concern rather than professional authority. Dr. Park was shouting something about energy readings, but her tone suggested wonder rather than scientific greed. Even Captain Ross had lowered his weapons, staring in amazement at the scene before him. Amy's team was seeing Ember as she had learned to see him, not as a monster or a specimen, but as a being capable of choice, of mercy, of love. Ember's field suddenly collapsed to almost nothing, leaving the chamber eerily quiet except for the gentle tinkling of cooling crystal formations. Amy's hand found his cheek, and through their connection she felt his exhaustion and shame. "I nearly became like them," Ember said, his thoughts flowing directly into Amy's mind, like the guardians who turned against their own people in the final days. "But you didn't," Amy replied through their link. "You chose to trust instead of destroy. That's what makes you different from them." Amy turned to face her team, her hand still resting on Ember's scaled cheek. "This is what I've been trying to tell you. He's not just intelligent, he's noble. He had the power to kill us all, but he chose mercy instead." Frank Wilson stepped forward slowly, his face pale with shock. "Amy, we didn't understand. When he was generating that much power, our sensors showed energy levels that could have cracked the planet's crust, but he stopped himself." Dr. Park was staring at Ember with new respect. The level of self-control required to contain that much energy. "It's beyond anything we thought possible." Captain Ross had completely lowered his weapons. "I've seen a lot of dangerous situations, but I've never seen anything choose to spare its enemies when it had the power to destroy them." Amy felt Ember's surprise through their connection. The humans were looking at him differently now, seeing him as she had tried to show them from the beginning, not as a threat to be contained, but as a being worthy of respect and understanding. "So what happens now?" Frank asked quietly. "We can't just pretend we never found him." Amy looked into Ember's golden eyes and felt his trust flowing through their connection. He was leaving the choice to her, confident that whatever she decided would be in both their best interests. "We protect him," Amy said firmly. "We classify Ashara as a protected world and establish a research station here. Small teams only, people who understand that they're guests in his domain." "And you?" Frank asked, though his expression suggested he already knew the answer. "I stay," Amy said without hesitation. "Someone needs to be here as a liaison, to help bridge the gap between his people's legacy and ours." Ember made a sound of deep contentment, and Amy felt his gratitude wash over her. After thousands of years of solitude, he would finally have a companion who understood his purpose and respected his dignity. Over the following months, Ashara became a different kind of research station. Scientists came to study the Solari ruins and learn from Ember's vast knowledge, but they came as students rather than conquerors. Ember shared the wisdom of his people freely, teaching humans about energy manipulation, sustainable technology, and the delicate balance required to maintain a peaceful civilization. Amy established her permanent quarters in the crystal chamber, close enough to maintain her connection with Ember, but far enough to give him space when he needed it. Their friendship deepened into something that transcended species boundaries, a bond built on mutual respect and understanding. In the evenings, Amy would read to Ember from Earth's literature, while he shared stories of Solari history through their psychic link. They watched Ashara's twin moons rise over the crystal canyons, two beings who had found what they had never known they were searching for, proof that friendship could bridge any gap, no matter how vast. Ember no longer struggled with his electrical field. Through Amy's friendship, he had learned to modulate his defenses consciously, choosing when to lower them and when to maintain them. He was no longer a prisoner of his own power, but its master, and Amy discovered that their connection was changing her as well. She began to sense electromagnetic fields naturally, to understand energy patterns that had once required instruments to detect. Their bond was creating something new, a bridge between human intuition and Solari wisdom that suggested incredible possibilities for both species. The ancient guardian had finally found peace, and in doing so, he had given humanity a gift beyond measure, the knowledge that intelligence and compassion could overcome any barrier, even those built by fear and misunderstanding. In the crystal chamber where Ember had waited in solitude for millennia, two friends sat together under alien stars, proof that in the vast loneliness of space, connection was always possible for those brave enough to reach for it.